them as we go throughout the presentation. But as Corey said, I'm Katie Schuman. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at the University of Tennessee. I am on the computer science side of the department. So I'm going to be talking about neuromorphic computing today from that computer science perspective. However, I do want to mention that we do have a large research group here at Tennessee that is focused on neuromorphic computing. That's from our all hands meeting this summer. So we have a large number of students and affiliated faculty who are working on neuromorphic computing here in Tennessee, both here at the university, but also at Oak Ridge National Lab, as well as faculty and researchers at other institutions as well, including SUNY Poly, George Mason, University of Mississippi, and Florida International. So we do work all across the neuromorphic computing stack in the 10 Lab group, from devices to architectures to software, algorithms, and applications. So like I said, I'm going to focus on the computer science aspect first, but I want to just briefly motivate. I'm a computer scientist, and so it is hard for me to think about hardware, but that is what I do every day now, and I want to motivate for you why you should also care about novel computer architectures, new computer architectures that we should be exploring in today's computing landscape. So there are really three components that lead us to looking at novel computer architectures, and the first is the looming end of Moore's law and the end of Dennard scaling. So depending on who you ask, you will hear that Moore's law has ended, it is in the process of ending, or it will never end, it's going to go on forever. My personal opinion is that the definition of whether or not it has ended doesn't really matter. What matters is we're seeing the consequences of whatever the looming end of Moore's law and the end of Dennard scaling in our compute systems today, particularly in the rising costs of energy and power to actually keep these systems running. So I was previously at Oak Ridge National Lab. I still work a lot with Oak Ridge, and they are currently running two of the world's largest supercomputers, Frontier, which is the fastest supercomputer in the world, and Summit, which I believe is the number 5 computer in the world. And I got the pleasure of seeing an entire power station being built just to power Frontier at Oak Ridge. So there's a huge amount of energy that's going into just powering today's compute systems. And so we really need to be looking to alternatives to help us do computing more efficiently, but also to continue to see performance improvements while also doing computing more efficiently. So that's one piece of we really need to be exploring alternative computer architectures so that we can continue to see speed ups in computing, but also do so not at the cost of all of this energy. To do it, the other component is that the types of computing that we are now doing are fundamentally different with the rise of AI and machine learning. This is truer today than it has ever been in the past, with the way that we're interacting with computers is just fundamentally different. There are a lot more AI and machine learning applications today than there were a decade ago because of the success of AI and machine learning. And these two pieces of extremely energy intensive computing and today's state of the art AI with systems like ChatGPT go hand in hand, where it's extremely expensive even to do inference with the sort of transformer models that ChatGPT relies on. So if we're thinking about building new types of computers that can accelerate computation, but also be more energy efficient, and at the same time, the way that we're doing computing is changing with the rise of AI and machine learning, it would make sense to also think about customizing systems, particularly for these types of applications. And then the third component that comes into play here is the rise of the Internet of Things. I actually heard a new term a couple of weeks ago, the Internet of Everything. We've gotten a little greedy. We're pushing compute everywhere. Compute is on my wrist, but it's also in my washing machine and in my microwave and out in remote sensors and into all sorts of autonomous systems. And so once again, with these sorts of deployment of compute and intelligence that we're expecting within edge systems, we need to be building custom compute platforms that can run very efficiently and in small form factors at the edge. So when we think about these three things together, it sort of leads us to looking to the brain for inspiration, because it is very efficient at performing intelligent tasks. And it does so in a form factor that can go out to the edge. right here with us. So it's a good source of inspiration to be looking towards. So in that realm, with that sort of in mind, I want to talk about two types of brain-inspired computing systems. And I make this distinction between what I call neural hardware and what I'm defining as neuromorphic computing. So neural hardware systems, by my definition, are those that accelerate traditional neural network and deep learning computation. They are built to do today's algorithms, and they tend to be systems that can give you very fast computation or very low power computation, not necessarily both. So for example, Google has their tensor processing unit, their TPU. They have a cloud version that's targeted towards very fast training, and they have an edge version that's targeted towards very low power inference, but those are two different architectures that are used in each of those scenarios. These are currently deployed in cloud mobile devices. Probably if you have a smartphone, you currently have a neural hardware system deployed into it. So what do I mean by traditional artificial neural network computation? I just want to quickly remind you what that computation sort of looks like. So this is a very, very simplistic cartoon level view of a feed-forward artificial neural network that has an input layer, two hidden layers, and an output layer. And what happens is numerical values come into this network. They simulate the input neurons. And each of these synaptic connections between layers has an associated weight value. All of those together form a weight matrix. And a matrix vector multiplication happens, followed by a nonlinear activation function of some kind, like a ReLU or a sigmoid, that's applied to that matrix vector product. And then you get the output values for the next layer. And this exact sort of computation is done throughout the rest of the network. As you move to more complex network architectures, the way that this math is constructed is slightly different, but on the whole, it's a lot of linear algebra that's happening, followed by nonlinear activations. So when we're talking about neural hardware systems, we're talking about that sort of computation. Now, I dabble a little bit in that sort of traditional neural network and deep learning side and a little bit on neural hardware, but the bulk of my work is actually on neuromorphic computing systems. So the way that I define neuromorphic systems are those that implement spiking recurrent neural network computation. They take more inspiration from the brain in the way that they operate, so much so that they can be suitable for neuroscience simulation. Now, the most exciting thing to me about neuromorphic computing systems is the promise for future algorithmic development to come up with new ways to leverage these systems to solve problems in computation. But on the hardware side, these are exciting because they can give you fast computation and low power. Now, these are still in development. There's some startups that are working on these systems. Intel and IBM have both developed full systems, but are very much on the research side. These are not quite ready for commercial deployment yet, whereas for the neural hardware systems, you can go buy one of these on Amazon today. You can't do that for a neuromorphic computing system just quite yet. So what does the sort of cartoon level view of a spiking neural network look like? Spiking neural networks and taking additional inspiration from the brain, they really do that in the incorporation of time in the way that they process information. And there can be time components on both the neurons and the synapses in spiking neural networks. You tend to see more complex network structures than feed forward. You tend to see a lot of recurrence, but they're typically not fully connected like a Hopfield network might be if you're familiar with those. They tend to be fairly sparse, but you have a lot of recurrence in the network. And then they receive input over time in the form of spikes, and they produce output over time in the form of spikes. So I showed you the little cartoon level view of the traditional neural network with the matrix vector computation. Let's take a look at a cartoon level view of what happens in a spiking neural network. So here we have some spikes that are going to come in over time. This is representing our input data. As the spikes are arriving over time, they will stimulate input neurons and potentially cause those to fire. So watch these two neurons, they're firing. As they fire, they generate spikes on all of their outgoing synapses, and keep an eye on these three spikes as they travel throughout the network. You'll note that that first spike has now arrived at its hidden neuron, its destination neuron within the network, while the other two are still in flight. This is that temporal component on those synapses at work. It takes time for information to travel throughout spiking neural networks, and you can see now those spikes are arriving at their destination neurons as well. You'll note, for example, you can have some weird stuff happen in spiking neural networks, like two synapses connecting the same two neurons. But because these two synapses have different temporal delays, they are functionally different in the way that they process information. So eventually, spikes are produced as output, and we can read those spikes out and interpret that as the answer to our problem. So this is a cartoon level view of a spiking neural network. This is one that I just made up so that I could make this animation in PowerPoint. It doesn't do anything. This is a spiking neural network that actually does something. I will tell you what it does later in the presentation, but you can see the input neurons are the yellow ones that are over here. The output neurons are the sort of red-orange ones over here, and the hidden neurons are the teal shown throughout. And then there are two different colored synapses, orange and blue. Those are excitatory and inhibitory. So let's take a look at the animation here. The neurons are going to light up as they are firing. And you can see the spikes traveling throughout the network, and you will also see the synapses light up as those spikes are reaching their destination neurons. So you can see this flurry of activity that's happening in the network, but one thing to keep in mind is most of the network is not active most of the time. So you can see there are very few neurons that are activating at any given time. So you have this sparseness in activity as well as sparseness in structure. And it is that sparsity in structure and activity that partially lends itself to the energy efficiency of spiking neuromorphic implementations. Okay, so hopefully this gives you a better idea of how spiking neural networks differ on the sort of algorithmic side from a traditional neural network. So I briefly want to mention that the vast majority of research in neuromorphic computing is in hardware. So there are a huge number of different devices and materials that are being used in neuromorphic hardware implementations. I've highlighted just a couple of those that have been previous research projects that I've worked on, including metal oxide memristive-based neuromorphic systems. This is work that was led by Garrett Rose's team here at the University of Tennessee. This is ongoing. We're still developing memristive neuromorphic systems here. I've also worked with researchers at NIST in looking at superconducting optoelectronic-based neuromorphic systems, as well as researchers in the mechanical engineering department here at UT and at Oak Ridge National Lab and looking at biomimetic devices. This is by far the weirdest device I've ever worked with in neuromorphic computing. It was literally 2 water droplets encased in lipids that you squish together, and the membrane that forms between them acts like a chemical synapse. When you apply a voltage to one side, it opens ion channels, and you can read out the current from the other water droplet. It behaves like a chemical synapse, and you can use it in a neuromorphic implementation. I'm actively working with researchers looking at various probabilistic devices like MTJs for neuromorphic implementations, at ferroelectric materials for neuromorphic implementations, at various quantum materials for neuromorphic implementations. There's just a huge amount of research that's going on the hardware side. However, that's the last time I'm going to talk about different devices and materials in this presentation, because my research lives up here in the neuromorphic computing stack. I focus on the applications, the algorithms, and the system software. So even though I live up here and we're going to focus mostly on this for the rest of the presentation, everything that's going on at the lower levels of the stack in the neuromorphic computing community influences my research. What the devices are, what the capabilities of the different circuits are, what the architectures are that are implemented, all of those both limit my potential research that I can do with my algorithms and applications, but it also gives inspiration for what we can do in our applications and algorithms, of giving potentially new capabilities that we've never even thought about our hardware having in the past, because it's difficult to simulate or just wasn't possible in our CPU or GPU-based systems that are now possible with these new devices and materials. That can really lend itself to creativity in the development of algorithms and applications for neuromorphic. So now I want to talk through some of the algorithmic considerations for neuromorphic systems, as well as the most popular algorithms in that space, and what the pros and cons are of those different approaches. So we're going to delve a little bit deeply into algorithms now. So because I can't just entirely leave hardware behind, we do have to think about what the considerations are for algorithmic development when we're looking at neuromorphic hardware. So different neuromorphic hardware systems have different realizable network structures, like the type of network topologies you can even put on the hardware can differ depending on the implementation. Frequently, with these emerging devices being used to implement neuromorphic systems, we have reduced precision in the synaptic weights. Whether or not your hardware system allows for on-chip training or chip in the loop, or if you're going to have to rely entirely on off-chip training, that's a consideration when you're developing your algorithms. Dealing with noise, process variation, and cycle-to-cycle variation can have a huge impact on performance. Whether your hardware is optimized for training or inference, and the reconfigurability of the neuromorphic hardware system can also have an impact on algorithmic development. So you can see on the right side of the slide here, a breakdown showing roughly the popularity of different types of algorithms within neuromorphic computing as of 2017. And this is from a survey paper that I worked on in 2017. And it shows that there are two major algorithms that have been used in the field, and we're going to talk about those now. So the first are backpropagation-like approaches. These take inspiration from the way that backpropagation works in traditional artificial neural networks, but there has to be some sort of algorithmic adaptation to deal with moving from the traditional network to the spiking network into the hardware. The biggest adaptation that has to be made is to deal with the non-differentiability of spiking neurons. There are lots of different ways that people deal with this. Some look at the charge level in the neuron, some look at the rate of the spikes that are coming out of the neuron. Lots of different ways that this is done. You also have to make adaptations for the low precision weights. And these algorithms tend to take a non-standard approach to dealing with the temporal delay aspect of spiking neural networks. For the most part, the temporal delays are often ignored altogether or just used to deal with the non-differentiability of the spiking neurons. And these also require relatively dense connectivity, which may or may not be supported by your neuromorphic implementation. So the key advantage of using these approaches is that there is decades of knowledge about traditional artificial neural networks that can be leveraged here. This can allow you to take all of that knowledge, the way that we can do this successfully on a wide variety of different problems with traditional artificial neural networks. We can now translate that onto spiking neural networks. However, I find this pretty unsatisfying because it doesn't work natively on a lot of the features of spiking neural networks that are really, I think, me personally, I think are very cool and attractive about spiking neural networks, like the sparse recurrence of these networks and that temporal capability. So it would be really awesome if we could actually leverage that capability with the algorithms that we're using for these systems. So that's backpropagation-like approaches. The most popular training approach in neuromorphic systems is synaptic plasticity mechanisms, particularly spike timing dependent plasticity, or STDP. I've given a depiction of what STDP might look like on the slide here, but you can think of it as a form of Hebbian learning with time. Neurons that fire together wire together, and neurons that fire closer together have stronger changes in their weights than those that fire farther apart. Now, the key advantage of these sort of synaptic plasticity-like mechanisms, they're very local. It's only influenced by the activity of the two neurons that are connected by the synapses in most cases. The key advantage here is that this is a mechanism that's observed in biological networks. So it is very biologically inspired. We know that STDP happens in biological brains. And it can be used as an unsupervised training mechanism. It doesn't necessarily need labels to be able to solve different tasks. And this has been shown in the literature as well, particularly for simple problems. However, the key disadvantage here is that it's not well understood and it's not particularly scalable, especially to more complicated tasks. So even though we know it exists in biology as a component that contributes to learning in biological brains, we know it's also not the only piece that's contributing to learning in biological brains. So with these two being by far the most popular training approaches in neuromorphic systems, and they have been the most popular for over a decade in neuromorphic research. As I was coming up and doing research as a graduate student in neuromorphic computing, it was particularly the disadvantages of these that I was really frustrated with. So I really wanted to be able to look at what the computational capabilities of spiking networks were for neuromorphic systems that sort of said, I don't want to use backpropagation. I don't just want to rely on synaptic plasticity. What do I do when I have no idea how to even start solving a problem? Well, we turn to evolutionary optimization to help us address these issues. Again, turning to nature for inspiration, like how did the biological brain and the structure of biological brain came to be? It was evolved over millennia, hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So the idea here was to say, okay, I'm going to assume I know nothing about what my spiking neural network should look like to solve a particular problem, because I didn't know what the spiking neural network should look like to solve a particular problem. I had no intuition about how to even start building these systems when I first started developing this tool. So this tool is called evolutionary optimization for neuromorphic systems, or EONs. And the idea here is you have a problem that you want to solve with neuromorphic systems, and you have a neuromorphic hardware platform that you want to solve it on. And you assume you know nothing about what that network should look like to solve the problem. So you start with a collection of randomly initialized potential solutions. So I'm showing 4 potential solutions here with different numbers of neurons and synapses and different levels of connectivity. This forms our initial population. Typically, in reality, our initial populations have 100 to 1,000 individuals, but 4 is what fit on the slide here. And what we do is we evaluate and we rank these. So what does evaluation mean? It means we take each of these networks, we load it onto our neuromorphic hardware, or usually a simulation of the hardware, and then we run it on the problem, or a simulation of the problem. We get a score for how well each of those networks is doing. And that score allows us to rank them from best to worst. Now, at the beginning, when they're randomly initialized, they're all terrible, but some of them are less terrible than others, which allows us to establish this ranking. From there, we do a selection procedure to preferentially select better performing networks to serve as parents while still maintaining diversity. And then we do reproduction operations to take those parents and create children from them. And those reproduction operators include things like mutations, where we randomly tweak by adding or deleting neurons, or adding or deleting synapses, or just changing the parameters within the network. And crossover or recombination, where we take 2 parents and produce children from those parents that inherit characteristics from both parents. So you can see an example of a network that was produced to be a crossover in this one here. Hopefully you can see my mouse on the slide. The one in the top of the child population, that child was the product of the top 2 parents. And you can see it inherited some of its inner connectivity from the second parent, while its outer connectivity was inherited from the first parent. So it gets characteristics from both, and that's the idea from crossover. So once we have this child population, we can then repeat this process, going through the evaluation, ranking, selection, and reproduction for generations. And each of these cycles is a generation in the evolutionary optimization. Now, the key disadvantage here is this can take a while to converge. There's a reason the acronym is EONs, but it's not as bad as you might think. All of the applications that I'm going to show you, the results that we achieved in under 24 hours. For most of them, the results were actually achieved within a couple of hours. But even though that's the key disadvantage, there are a lot of advantages to using evolutionary optimization for neuromorphic systems, and it's why it was my dissertation in graduate school, and it's why we've continued to use it over the last decade in our research group, and our collaborators have used it as well. And here are those reasons. It is applicable to a wide variety of tasks. I'm going to give you some examples of those tasks. It can work on things like classification, anomaly detection, control, whatever. As long as you can assign a score for saying one network is better than another, it can work on that task. It can work across different hardware implementations. And as you saw previously, I work with a lot of people who have a lot of different hardware. And so being able to change from one hardware implementation to another relatively quickly is very important, as well as the ability to operate within whatever characteristics that hardware has and whatever constraints that hardware has. It can learn the topology and the parameters, not just synaptic weights, so it gives you what the structure of the network should be. It can interact with software simulations or directly with hardware, and it's parallelizable or scalable. So if you happen to have a supercomputer, you can use it to get to better solutions faster. If you don't, if you are now here at Tennessee, I have access to Summit and Frontier at Oak Ridge still, but we typically actually just do training on our workstations. Like I have a workstation behind me that we use training on. I will also frequently just do training on my laptop, but it's parallelizable, so we can actually accelerate it through multi-threading or multi-processing. Okay, so that's an idea of some of the algorithms associated with neuromorphic systems. Those are just, the top 2, and then an approach that we use in the evolutionary optimization space. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some applications that we have applied neuromorphic computing to. And we have a diverse set of applications here that really try to leverage different aspects of neuromorphic systems for those different applications. So the first one is an application from high energy physics. This is one that's now about 5 years old, 6 years old, but we are still actively working with researchers at Fermi National Accelerator Lab on applying neuromorphic computing to similar high energy physics experiment data. So this is an example from the Minerva detector, which was a neutrino scattering experiment at Fermi Lab. Fermi Lab is a Department of Energy lab just outside Chicago. And you can see a picture of the detector here, a cartoon of the detector. There's a little person for scale there. So this is like the size of a school bus. And this detector is exposed to a neutrino beam that comes in the front here, hits through this green plate. Neutrinos are very, very, very small and don't interact with a lot of material. So there's very dense material inside here. And they are looking to try to capture interactions between neutrinos and nuclei within the detector. And all these little boxes on top of the detector are the pixels that make up the detector. So the researchers at Fermi Lab had a bunch of simulated data that was similar to the data that they would get off of these detectors. And what they wanted to do was to have a classification task where they wanted to look at the data that came off of this detector and identify the horizontal region along the detector where the interaction originated. There was all sorts of activity within the detector, and they wanted to look at that activity that sort of looked like fireworks to try to identify where the original interaction occurred. So the interesting thing about this is that the researchers at Fermi Lab actually approached the research group I was at Oak Ridge National Lab to take a deep learning approach to this task. And they did that. They did want to do deep learning on this data. But the data that was coming off of this detector was inherently temporal in nature. It actually is basically event-based data. It's natively spiking because each of these pixels would light up when the energy in that particular location in the detector went over a certain threshold. So it was event-based. So it mapped very naturally to spike-based approaches. So we took both the deep learning approach to this task as well as the spiking neuromorphic approach to this task, and we got really similar accuracy results on both tasks. But here's the really interesting thing. The top network that you see is the result of a neural architecture search. So the architecture itself was optimized in this case, along with the parameters. And you can see, if you're familiar with the structure of convolutional neural networks, these last few layers here are fully connected layers. And the numbers shown in parentheses are the number of neurons in that layer. So just this layer here has 98 neurons in it. You'll note that our entire spiking neural network only has 90 neurons and 86 synapses in it. So by leveraging the temporal processing capability of the network, we were able to get significantly smaller networks. Now, we estimated what the energy usage would be for a memoristive neuromorphic implementation that Garrett Rose's team here at Tennessee developed, and it would be about 1.66 microjoules per classification. But let me tell you what people who have a school bus size detector don't care about: energy usage. They don't care anything about energy usage. They don't care about neuromorphic because it's more energy efficient. They care about neuromorphic because it's custom hardware and it can go fast if it needs to. You can build neuromorphic implementations that can be significantly faster than your traditional hardware implementations. And that's what they need in these high energy physics experiments. So the high energy physicists do not care at all about energy usage. They just want to have custom neuromorphic processors that can go fast enough to keep up with the data that is coming off of these detectors. And so that's why they're continuing to be interested in neuromorphic computing systems. And smaller is faster. So that's why they also care about looking at the spiking neural network results. So that's an example of looking at natively temporal data using eons, and that was how this network was produced to come up with a network to get something that is of interest to a particular domain. So the next application is also working with folks from a Department of Energy lab, in this case, Oak Ridge National Lab, looking at radiation detection. Now, this was an example where they have, again, temporal data, and they needed an algorithm that can detect low signal-to-noise ratio anomalies in very noisy and very dynamic data environments. And they need it, in this case, to be extremely low power. So the idea here is that they wanted to build a system, and hopefully you can see my camera, because they want to build like a Coke can size detector that has the actual detector itself, the sensor, for the radiation in the environment, but also the neuromorphic implementation that could do real-time anomaly detection, that could all be powered on a small solar panel that could sit out in an environment and monitor that environment for a long period of time, basically indefinitely, with just that one power source. So power was very, very important here, as well as the actual form factor of the system. So in this case, we have applied to both simulated data as well as real world data on this task. The results on this slide are actually a little bit older. As you might imagine, this is the sort of work that has to be approved by the Department of Energy to be released. So I can talk about it, but I don't have the updated slide yet. We've gotten really, really good results, very close to actually outperforming the deep learning approach to this task. But we're doing so with a very, very small FPGA-based neuromorphic implementation. This whole system here is an FPGA-based neuromorphic system that was developed at Oak Ridge called Micro Caspian. It's smaller in form factor than the size of a credit card. And the actual FPGA is this little black chip right here, which is about a $7 FPGA that can run on 1 to 2 milliwatts. And so they have built a complete form factor for this. We're actually almost completely done with this project now, where we're getting really nice results, and we are testing it on real world data. We are seeing really nice transferability from the simulated data to the real world data that we are collecting. And in fact, we're doing one of our last real world data collection events. They're actually going to drive our Coke can detector with the neuromorphic system from Oak Ridge down to downtown Knoxville and back. It's about an hour round trip on Wednesday this week to detect and do real-time detection with our neuromorphic system all along the way. So this is an example of a case where the goal here was to get that very low power operation, but also to leverage the temporal processing capability of the neuromorphic system. And again, in this case, the goal here was not maximizing classification accuracy. This is an anomaly detection task. So we are now looking at things like precision and recall in the optimization, and we can change that objective easily with the evolutionary optimization algorithm. Okay, this is a third application. Now we're pivoting into control. In this case, we're again working with folks from Oak Ridge, this time from the Transportation Research Center, the National Transportation Research Center, who wanted to apply neuromorphic computing to do real-time control of internal combustion engines. So in this case, we want to read data in real time from sensors in the engine to give us operating characteristics of how the engine is currently performing, and to decide how much fuel to inject on the next cycle into the engine in order to keep the engine running normally, but also to decrease the amount of fuel required to keep it running. So this is the point where it's worth noting that I know nothing about high energy physics. I don't know anything about radiation detection. I know the extent that I know about internal combustion engines is that I have a car. Everything you have heard me say has been what I have learned from my collaborators, but that's about it. That's about the level of where my knowledge goes. But we're able to take these tools that we've developed and apply to these different domains relatively easily, because all we need is the ability to measure the scores of how well they're performing. So in this case, we had a simulator of the engine. So they basically handed that simulator off to us and said, okay, here are the observations that you're going to get from the simulator, and here are the actions you can take, which are just changes in the amount of fuel that you're going to apply on the next cycle. And that simulator gave us performance metrics about how the engine would be performing in those as you change those conditions. So we basically treated it like a black box. I would just, plug in eons to it. We actually did some training on Summit here. That makes it sound like this was a lot harder than it was. We only trained on 20 of Summit's 4,600 nodes for like an hour to get these results. And we tested it with the simulator in the loop. just seeing how well the network was performing, again, trying to keep the engine running normally, which in this case was minimizing partial burns and misfires, while also minimizing the amount of fuel that was being used. So then once we actually had those networks that we trained in the simulator, we could then actually go to deploy them to the National Transportation Research Center. So I'm going to take a moment here and tell the story of this. So this work was actually going on in 2020. So during the pandemic, when we were all working from home. And so I did all of this training using the Summit supercomputer from my basement at my house. The engineer who was working with us, who was developing MicroCaspian, had actually breadboarded up his MicroCaspian implementation at his apartment. And we did all of this work, and they were ready to test it on the engine. So he took his breadboarded Caspian implementation, drove it to the National Transportation Research Center, handed it to the postdoc in the parking lot, who was actually allowed to go into the lab because he needed to do experimental work. That postdoc took the breadboard in, plugged it into the engine, and this is the video that they sent us. So this is the breadboarded MicroCaspian. This is before we had the PCB. And it is plugged into, at this point, it's interfacing to the engine through LabVIEW, because that's how we start. And you can also tell it's real science because everything's duct taped together. So there's the MicroCaspian system connected right at this point via USB to a system running LabVIEW that is interfacing with the engine. So in real time, we're receiving from the engine 3 sensor values, which are going out at each cycle to the MicroCaspian board. That's where it's running the network that we trained on Summit, that is sending back the fuel amount to inject on the next cycle to the engine. And this is running in real time, even with USB, which is super slow, and even through LabVIEW, which is also super slow. So we are working right now on actually improving this interface where we're interfacing directly through the CAN bus with the engine. And we're working on extending this to other engine types beyond this particular engine, which is a diesel engine. We're looking at other engines moving forward for other domains like rail and marine to also improve efficiency. This last application is just one that is a student application that various groups of students have worked on over the last couple of years, and is one of our just for fun applications. So we wanted to test to see how neuromorphic systems would behave in an autonomous vehicle application. And so we wanted to start with a simple autonomous vehicle application, in particular just a racing task. So there is a community that does 1/10 scale autonomous racing called F1/10, and it's meant to be Formula One style racing. So they have specs for building out cars, 1/10 scale cars that can do autonomous racing on it. This is one of those, one of the specs that they have published, built to specification, including an NVIDIA Jetson on board here. We were actually also going to use this car to do deep learning based autonomous driving research. What is not to spec and what's not normal here is that MicroCaspian neuromorphic implementation that we have zip tied to the top of the car. In this case, again, zip ties and duct tape, y'all. That's real world science. So we wanted to evaluate how neuromorphic would behave in this sort of application, because in this case, this is one where low size, weight, and power is critical for its operation. So there is a simulator for the F1/10 community that has been implemented and given to the community. And that simulator provides us observation LiDAR values, which are that's the sensor that's on the car. And what it accepts back as actions are the steering angle and the speed. So we once again use EONs to train spiking neural networks. And then we take our best evolved spiking neural networks and we deploy them. Both we evaluate it on the CPU simulating the neuromorphic system on the Jetson, as well as on the physical MicroCaspian system itself to control the physical car. So to give you an idea, in the simulated environment in the that the F1/10 community provides, you train on Formula One tracks. So this is after training. This is one of the hopefully you can see the car. That's not an ant on your screen or a speck of dust. It is the car driving around the track here. So this is what an example of a Formula One track looks like. I'm not gonna lie to y'all, I don't know anything about Formula One. I barely know things about NASCAR, and I'm from the South, so that's a miracle that I don't. But I was expecting like oval, oval. This is Formula One tracks don't look like that. So it had to be able to take what it had learned in training we trained on 5 Formula One tracks and extend to other Formula One tracks that it had not seen during the training process in order to do well in simulation. If it did sufficiently well in simulation, we were ready to then deploy it to the physical car and evaluate whether it was actually able to take what it learned in simulation and translate it to physical tracks. Now, in order to do that, you have to build a physical track, which we did. Again, this was started during the pandemic, so this was the first time we tested where we did in fact build a racetrack in my basement. That is where this track was. Same place that I was training those engine networks. My desk was in a corner back behind the track in this space. And you can see this was the very first day that we actually did deployment to the physical car. And you can see that, it's not going terribly fast, but it was able to take what it had learned in simulation and translate it to the physical car. This is where we're actually running with the hardware in the loop on the car, and this was a track that we built at Oak Ridge National Lab to do testing there, but you can see the micro-Caspian system is zip tied to the top of the car here. The only input that it has here is the LiDAR input. You may notice that there are blue pieces of tape on the ground. It is not getting any information from those blue pieces of tape. Those blue pieces of tape were there for us to mark how far the car had traveled to be able to calculate speed from the car. This was entirely a student project. The original car, all of the training and testing was done by 2 high school students from Oak Ridge High School, both of whom are now at MIT as undergrads. And we have continued this work at the University of Tennessee, where 2 senior design teams built their own cars, customized the specifications to their own needs. And we actually did a time trial with their 2 race cars at the end of last semester. I don't have those videos in this presentation, but I should get those soon. Okay, so those are some examples of applications. I'm going to take the last 5 minutes of this time to take a brief detour into thinking about neuromorphic computing and computer science. So neuromorphic computing systems have a lot of really cool characteristics. They have massively parallel computation, co-located processing and memory, simple processing elements that perform very specific computation, simple communication, event-driven, stochastically firing neurons, and they're inherently scalable. Now, if you forget that this is a brain-inspired computing system and you just look like these are some cool characteristics that can be leveraged for other computing problems besides just machine learning. So some of the work that our research group has dabbled in, as well as lots of other folks at other institutions, is looking at other computer science problems that neuromorphic systems can solve. So we and others have looked at solving different types of graph algorithms, including shortest path using spiking neural networks. In this case, if you're doing shortest path calculation, you take your graphs and you convert them into networks. So nodes become neurons, edges become synapses. The distances, if you have a weighted graph, are converted into the time delays within the network. And then you spike your source neuron and allow spikes to travel throughout the network. And if you happen to have plasticity on your system, you can also extract the paths back out and not just the distances. We've done a weird thing with that to say we can also do, using spiking recurrent neural networks, we can do sparse binary matrix vector multiplication, because a way that you can solve shortest path calculations is doing binary matrix vector multiplication. So we decided to use shortest path to do that instead of use matrix vector to solve shortest path. And we demonstrated that in a workshop paper in 2021. One of the interesting applications that we did, again, it was 2020, so a lot of people were thinking about epidemics and pandemics for, no particular reason. We also showed that you can do epidemic spread modeling using neuromorphic systems, where the neurons in your system become individuals in a population. Synapses are shared social connections, and the spikes are transmission of infection. And by setting the parameters up differently within the network, you can replicate different types of conditions like mask wearing, stay-at-home orders, and things like that. And you can do essentially SIR modeling, or susceptible, infected, recovered, as well as SEIR, susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered models, which are what was predominantly used in doing epidemic spread modeling. So with that, I just want to briefly summarize. Neuromorphic computers are a new type of computer inspired by the brain. They're programmed using spiking neural networks, and there are a variety of ways that spiking neural networks can be trained. There's not one clear winner here. We've successfully applied Neuromorphic to a wide variety of applications, including scientific data analysis and robotics. And I just want to leave you on that Neuromorphic computers are useful for more than just neural network computation. There's a lot of interesting work to be done there, and we're just getting started in the community. So with that, I will thank the 10 Lab as well as my collaborators at Oak Ridge. This work was predominantly supported by the Department of Energy and the Air Force Research Lab. And with that, I will thank you, and I will take your questions, which I think I'm getting in the
yes, thank you, Katie, so much for the wonderful talk. So if anyone has questions, you can type them into the Q&A. It looks like we have a few so far, so I'll start